Hello, learners, and welcome to Chapter 3, Cell Structure and Function. Now, in Chapter 2, we focused on basic chemistry and we learned about atoms, but in Chapter 3, we're going to learn about cells, and this is all going to be about our journey to figuring out the hierarchy of an organism. We start off with the chemicals and the atoms, and then we go into the cells, and these cells are used to create tissues, which you go into for Chapter 4. Now, as you can see here, this is the general kind of schematic of a cell. Your goal is you definitely want to be able to label this overall cell schematic. I do show you a different one as well, just so your brain can have multiple versions of what a cell can look like. And if you go on Google, you'll probably see even more versions. But as you can see, there is a nucleus here. We have our smooth endoplasmic reticulum and our rough endoplasmic reticulum. We have a Golgi apparatus. We have some mitochondria. And then we have some centrioles and some stuff from the cytoskeleton as well. And that's really the general idea that you're going to see. And of course, the main thing that's kind of holding all this stuff inside is going to be that plasma membrane. And so we get to kind of go into details about some of the functions and of course the structure of a lot of these different organelles and just some basic components of the cell in general. So let's go ahead and get organized. What do we actually get to learn in this lecture? Well, first we're going to learn about cells and we're going to learn about the basic components of cells, kind of sort of what they look like and the diversity of cells. And then we're going to go into the plasma membrane and cell junctions. So the plasma membrane is going to be that stereo barrier that's kind of holding everything inside the cell together. And so we're going to talk about the plasma membrane. We're also going to talk about cell junctions, which allow different cells to be connected to one another. And then we'll go into the cytoplasm. The cytoplasm, I think, is what most students are used to understanding when it comes to cells. It's all the stuff inside the cells, including like the cytosol, which is like the fluid inside, and also the organelles, okay? So organelles like, oh, I know what a mitochondria is. Most folks will say the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. That's where those details are coming from. But we also get to kind of add in cellular extensions like microvilli and flagella and cilia, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, we're going to focus on the nucleus. And of course, that's where all of our DNA is. It helps us encode proteins. And we know proteins are super ubiquitous from Chapter 2. So this is going to be our understanding of how and the function of the overall nucleus and how it works. Now, here's another kind of little schematic of the cell. You have everything outside the cell, which is the extracellular fluid. You have the plasma membrane, like that barrier. And then you have the cytoplasm, which includes cytosol and its organelles. Now, the way you organize yourself when you're learning this is going to be really up to you. I'm going to show you multiple ways to organize it so that you can focus on, hey, this is how I want to do it. This is how I want to remember the material. One thing I like to do in my lectures is I have to make sure that whatever study guide you're given, I'm answering those questions in the lecture itself. So you don't have to do separate things. You don't have to say, oh, I'm watching a lecture, then I have to go back and complete the study guide. No. If you go to any after lecture section that I provide, because I'm doing the lecture portion for this time, you will see the exam 1 study guide there. If you click on that study guide, you're going to have questions from Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 3, 4, and 5, which includes exam number 1. And you should be able to answer all those questions as we go through the lecture itself. Another thing you can do is look at the active reading guides for each chapter. And if you're a person who wants to make sure you're actively reading and not just kind of memorizing a bunch of stuff, they have a lot of great little mini worksheets inside those active reading guides to help you get the details of what's necessary for each chapter. Okay, folks, so that's really how my brain kind of works. And then there's also going to be Chapter 3 activities. It's just little activities after you watched the lecture, after you might have done some active reading guides, or you went over things on your own. You might want to just fill out some things and watch a couple videos. That's what those activities are for. All right, folks, let's go ahead and get started. So again, I showed you kind of an overall idea of what the cell looks like. But guess what? Not every cell looks the same. There's over 250 different types of human cells. I mean, we're talking from blood cells like erythrocytes or red blood cells, skeletal muscle cells, adipose cells or fat cells. We're talking about immune storage for immune cells in your immune system, neurons in your brain, or you can call them brain cells as well. And of course, sperm for males, and that helps with reproduction. So there's so many different types of cells, even beyond the ones that we see here. And they look very different from the cell that I showed you earlier. So your question might be like, well, how do I put this all together? Well, our way to put it together is to give you the basic parts that mostly all cells have and the common functions of some of the organelles that can be within those basic parts. So that's the whole goal here. Now, as you go up higher and we learn about tissues and then we start getting into organ systems, etc., you're going to be learning about different types of cells that belong to different types of tissues and those functions and everything like that. So that's kind of how we build up into that hierarchy. All right, folks. Now, these cells are different in size, shape, all their components. So not every single cell is going to have just one single nucleus like we saw before. Some have multiple nucleus, and it all depends on their function that they're trying to carry out. Okay. And again, just like anything else, structure is going to dictate function. So even as we go through anatomy, you're going to be like, oh, this looks different. So if it looks different, its function could be different. You got to keep that in mind. So let's get into some basic functions of the cell next. So I'm sitting here talking about, hey, there's all these different types of cells. Well, what are the overall functions of a cell? There's many functions, okay? First, let's think about growth. That means cells are going to increase in size in some type of way. So if you think about a person exercising, the muscle cells that you're actually using, and I'm like pumping my bicep right now, but the muscle cells that I'm using is going to create hypertrophy. And that means that you're increasing the actual muscle if you're doing some kind of resistance training or something like that, right? So the cells have the ability to grow. That's just one example of a muscle cell, okay? Reproduction. Cells have the ability to divide. And that means, like, say you get a cut on your arm, you clean up your cut, everything's good, and then all of a sudden you're like, hey, I have a scab, and hey, now this scar is definitely healed. That's because your skin cells have the ability to divide, okay? And there's two ways that we see division for overall body cells. Is going to be mitosis, and meiosis specifically means that we are doing division of sperm and egg, okay? Next, we have metabolism. Metabolism is all about the chemical reactions inside your body. So in chapter 2, yes, we talked about atoms, we saw chemical reactions, and every single chemical reaction that's possible in your body, meaning building up or synthesizing something like a protein or breaking down a protein to its amino acids. If I'm going back to chapter 2 information, all those reactions together are called metabolism. Okay, folks? And you see catabolism here and anabolism. That's just referring to chemical reaction and help build things up and also break things down, okay? Now, let's think about some chemical reactions in the body. Let's see, obviously cell respiration, that's probably the big one that we see. We're taking in glucose or carbohydrates, and we're, of course, creating a reaction with oxygen to form CO2, water, and good old ATP for energy. That's one thing we see. Also, the liver cells, like liver cells on their own, they're going to metabolize drugs and alcohol that you may have put in your body, for example, so that you don't go into some type of sickness just from, drinking a can of beer or something like that. So just keep those details in mind as well. Now, cells can also communicate, which to me is always the coolest part. And if you love cell communication, you can always take a biochemistry course called signal transduction in the future. You can get more details about that. This means that cells have the ability to send and receive signals. How do they do that? Through little tiny chemical messengers that we get to learn about when we talk about the endocrine system and things like that, that can actually say, hey, the body may need glycogen or glucose. So for example, if you are somebody who is taking in a large meal, let's say that you need to store some of that excess glucose. And so your body's going to say, hey, I have excess glucose, I need to store it. Am I going to store it in my muscles? Am I going to store it in my liver, for example? Or insulin, for example, can basically signal the cells to uptake glucose. If you have low blood sugar, your body's going to say, hey, we need to make sure we uptake glucose so that you can actually get your blood sugar in check. So it's kind of really cool to see the communication. We get to talk about the organelles that help us connect those things. Another thing that cells can do is move substances in and out of those cells. And that has to do with transport. A lot of times you're thinking of membrane transport, but you also can be transporting little vesicles that kind of pinch off out into the cell or out of the cell as well, which is pretty cool. Okay? Now, if you're taking the physiology course, you go into more details about membrane transport. For anatomy, we just want to make sure you understand the functions and get down the overall basic parts of the cell so that when you see different types of diversity of cell, you can say, here's what I saw before of all these different parts, but this cell doesn't have a nucleus, or this cell doesn't have that many mitochondria. I wonder why. And then you can start relating it to the function of those cells and therefore those tissues. All right, folks? And then finally, the big kahuna of this all is maintaining homeostasis. Okay, so homeostasis is how we are able to regulate anything that's happened internally and externally to our body. Okay, so it's really how the cells are going to respond to their environment. That means all the extracellular fluid in the body, and also how we respond to our environment as well. So you can have different stimulus and the response, it goes through your central nervous system, and then of course you have a product that says, hey, this is what we're going to do. So for example, the kidney cells, for example, are going to regulate electrolyte balance, like sodium in your body, and also balance the blood pH. So if your blood pH is too high or too low, there's usually going to be different enzymes that help with that. And then also your kidneys are going to help regulate that as well. So we get a little details about that too. Now, here's a big kahuna, another big kahuna, because I keep saying it, I don't know. Cells lose the ability to, if cells end up losing the ability to basically regulate any of these functions, that's when we get disease, folks. So let's just think of growth, for example. If you have uncontrolled cell growth, you keep on making more and more and more and more cells, guess what? You can end up producing a tumor. Now, of course, that tumor can be benign or metastatic, but either way, you are producing a tumor because of uncontrolled cell growth. And that means that there's some issue in how you're regulating cell division. There's some kind of fail in there that you have to focus on. And of course, you can end up having a disease like cancer. So you want to keep all these little details in mind as we're going through, because the function of the cell is going to matter, especially when you get into tissues and you have to start like identifying what specific tissues may have, what specific cells may be a part of different tissues. For example, if you look at a neuron, it's going to look different. Let's go ahead and go back to that slide just to help you out here. For example, our red blood cells, they don't have nuclei part when they're mature. So then you're thinking like, oh, well, a nerve cell does. The nerve cell has different endings as well. It has a long tail as well. So all these little details you're going to start understanding. But remember, function still matters. And when you start looking at these structures, and I'm speaking on structures because when they come together, they start forming tissues. So look at this skeletal muscle cell, and then look at these smooth muscle cells. They can continue to come together and attach together through cell junctions and form a tissue. So you want to keep that in mind as well. All right, so let's go ahead and get into the basic parts we've been yapping about. So there's 3 basic components of a cell. That means mostly all cells have these basic parts. First things first, they're going to have a plasma membrane. So remember I was telling you about that external barrier for the cell. That's that plasma membrane, this whole thing. Okay, and yes, it's a membrane. So how that membrane, the anatomy of that membrane, what that looks like, what it does, some functions of it, yeah, we're going to get into. Okay, and the fact that it's selectively permeable, we're going to get into that. Then we also have the cytoplasm. So the cytoplasm and the cytosol, some stuff that students usually have issues with. Cytoplasm is containing 2 things, the cytosol and the organelles. And I feel like this is again where students really remember from even high school, like, hey, I know what some of the organelles are. There goes the Golgi apparatus, right? But some folks kind of confuse cytosol and cytoplasm. So cytoplasm is everything inside of the cell, and cytoplasm is made of cytosol and organelle. Also, some cytoplasms have inclusions in them. And so inclusions are basically like these little storage units. And a lot of the times you can think of storage units that they're not going to be part of anything that's happening as far as chemical reactions or anything like that. But they can store nutrients and pigments or even waste. So think about it. If you have a lot of melanin in your skin, melanin is a part of an inclusion in skin cells. So that melanin is a pigment. And that's why you have different skin tones. And when you're in the sun, we end up forming more melanin, because the melanin's goal is to protect the DNA that's in the nucleus, protect it from like UV radiation. And some folks have a lot of melanin pigment in their actual skin cells. So they would have a lot more inclusions in that route. Okay. You also can think of inclusions for like lipid storage or fat storage as well for certain cells. And of course, good old organelles, again, mitochondria, endoplasmic reticulum, smooth and rough, Golgi apparatus, and the nucleus itself, cytoskeleton portions, etc., etc. And then finally, the last basic part that majority of all cells have is going to be a nucleus, because that is the control center. It tells us what proteins to make and has all the genetic information to create proteins. And then that's our DNA. And then our RNA is going to be helping us get that message out and actually make the proteins. And then you go to the plasma membrane and send them where they need to be. Or they might just stay inside the cell and get what they need. So I just want everybody to keep that in mind. This is where you want to start when you're thinking of cells. Make sure you understand those 3 components, because when you start learning about histology or tissues, you want to be able to recognize, oh, okay, I see the plasma membrane here. This has to be a nucleus. If I don't see a nucleus, I wonder why. What's the function of this? Those details are going to matter as we go to chapter 4. All right, folks, let's move on to actually getting into some details of this stuff. So, for example, let's get into the plasma membrane next. Then we'll do cytoplasm, and then we'll end the lecture with the nucleus. All right, folks, see you in the next video.